it's time to start. Dear all, welcome to attend Professor Timothy Williamson's third lecture at Wuhan University. As the chair, it's my duty to introduce Professor Timothy Williamson. In the first two lectures, Professor Turnbull has given a wonderful introduction to Professor Williamson. Maybe there are new audience today, so it's still my duty to introduce the speaker. Here are two new photos of Professor Timothy Williamson. Okay, now titles and honors of Timothy Williamson. He's the Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford University. Sorry, I switched this item.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, just this switch item. I can't see the whole screen. Okay, now it's okay. Sorry. He's the Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford University. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's a member of the the European Academy of Science and the International Academy of Philosophy of Science. He's a foreign member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, and a foreign member and an international honorable member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy. Okay, just a brief introduction about his research and the publications of Timothy Williamson. He works on a lot of a wide range of fields, especially his research covers philosophical logic, epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, and metaphilosophy. He has made many contributions to these fields. He is the author of quite many influential books. Most of them have been or will be translated into Chinese and published in China. Okay, especially has 8 books. For example, Identity and Discrimination, Vagueness, Knowledge and its Limits, The Philosophy of Philosophy, Model Logic as Metaphysics, Suppose and Tell, Debating the a priori, Teleology, Doing Philosophy. Also, there are several books about his philosophy. For example, Williamson on Knowledge, Williamson on Modality, and Knowledge First. Okay, during this lecture, the audience can write down your question in the chat box, and the staff at Xuexuzhi will forward your question to us. At the end of his lecture, I'm very sorry, this is a type of field, okay. At the end of this lecture, Professor Timothy Williamson will give his replies. Also, it's our pleasure that we invite Professor Wenfang from the Shandong University to as the interlocutors of this lecture. Okay, let's now welcome Professor Timothy Williamson for his lecture at Wuhan University. Today he will talk about epistemicism. Okay, now welcome, please.
Right. Well, thank you very much. So first, we have to share my screen. So I'm getting a message which is saying that you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. So you'll need to adjust something. Make me a co-host or something. You'll need to do something so that I can share my screen.
I have a question from share my slide. So I think now you can share your slide.
Okay, let me try that. Yeah, just a minute. Okay.
陈勇，你这把你的那个关了吗？
我的已经关掉了。
哦。
Okay, is that okay now? Are you
No,
getting
no, no. We don't
I
we
didn't
don't
see the
say
slide.
your.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Then we'll have to do this again.
Just off of the 叙事制, please invite Professor Williamson to as the co-host of this Zoom, because only host or co-host has the right to share the slide. Please.
哎，他们没给他把开放传递给他。
对，应该把它报告人设置为就是联席主持人或者主持人，他才可以分享。
I may have, yeah, there's something going wrong. I'm going to have to leave the meeting and then.
Okay, just wait for a while. The speaker will enter again and share his slide. Okay. Okay, now you are the co-host. I think you can share the slide now.
Okay, now so share screen. Yeah, that looks good. And okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. All right. So sorry for the delay. So I'm going to be talking today about a theory which I defend called epistemicism. And if you don't know what epistemicism is, don't worry, you will find out in the course of this lecture. So epistemicism is my preferred theory of vagueness, and if you're not sure what the sort of philosophical problem of vagueness is, don't worry, because I'll start by discussing that and what the problem is and how I came to work on it. So I hope this lecture will be more or less self-explanatory. So in lecture 2, I discussed the non-transitivity of indiscriminability, which is closely related to the problem of vagueness. And so just to go over that, the relevant aspects of this phenomenon again, I'll talk through an example. So just imagine a long series of color samples, maybe 100 or 1,000 of them, S0, S1, S2, all the way up to Sn. Doesn't matter exactly how many there are, and so the color sample at one end of this series is clearly red. I mean, you can just easily see that it's red, and the sample at the other end of the series is clearly yellow, and of course red and yellow are incompatible colors. Nothing can be both. And then for each intermediate stage, if you look at any two neighboring samples in the series, they are indiscriminable from each other in color. So you can't see by the naked eye, just as well, without some kind of special technological aids or something. You can see by the naked eye that they differ in color as well. For all you can know just by looking at them, that they may be exactly the same. So, I mean, suppose that we ask a question, imagine we're actually in the situation with these samples in front of us, and we ask which sample is the last red one in the series. And it's clear that if we look at any two samples in the series that are next to each other, that you can't see by the naked eye that SK is red and the next one, SK plus 1, is not red. Because if you could see that, you could discriminate between them in color. You could see, you could deduce that they were not the same color. One is red and the other is not. But this is kind of puzzling, because seeing just by the naked eye, that's the normal basis for determining whether something is red or not. And yet, using this normal basis for determining the color of something, we actually cannot identify which sample in the series is the last red one. And even if we made some kind of differentiation that is weaker than calling one of them red and calling the next one not red, supposing we just called one of them red and then we refused to call the next one red, so we just we refused to say anything about whether it was red or not. That differentiation between the different treatment that we're giving to SK and SK plus 1, calling one red and calling the other red, that seems kind of arbitrary and unmotivated, because we can't actually see that there's any difference in color between them. And it's not clear why we're suddenly stopping calling samples red at that point rather than some other point. So, I mean, suppose that we have to, as it were, choose a moment in the series where we stop applying the term red. It seems that we won't really have a good non-arbitrary basis for picking any particular point and saying I'll call them red up to here and I won't call them red after that. And so in examples like this, just our ordinary understanding of our language leaves us confused and uncertain. And obviously this is not just something about the word red, this is something much more universal and widespread than that. Now, one thing that we could do is we could make the word red more precise by stipulating a more or less arbitrary definition. We could just say, well, we'll call it red up to this point and not red after that, and that's simply going to be how we use the word red, and that's just a decision that we make, even if it's a slightly arbitrary decision. We could do that if we wanted to, and that might solve some immediate practical problem in a local context. It might be that we just need to make a decision about that, and it doesn't matter too much where we draw the line, but we do need, for some practical reason or other, to draw the line somewhere. But for purposes of general communication, we need words like red, which can be applied without an apparatus of rigorous definitions. I mean, it's obvious that we couldn't really apply the term in the way that we normally do. If we had some special rules about where in this series of color samples we were going to stop calling it red, that's simply not how we use color terms normally, and it would be extremely inconvenient if we did have to use them that way. So so that's really only a kind of a solution to an immediate practical problem. It's not a kind of general reform of the language that it would make much sense to do. Anyway, although we can reduce vagueness by special definitions, we can't eliminate it completely, because even the words in the definitions will have some vagueness. Even if we were to make that stipulation about a particular series of color samples, about which ones we'd call red and which ones we wouldn't, that would still leave us with problems with some other series of color samples. So it would not be a general solution, even if it were practical to use color terms according to that kind of stipulated definition. And so it seems clear that we must live with vagueness in our language and thought, and learn how to handle it correctly. So I've been talking about the word red, but I think it's also this is not just something about the meaning of words in the public language. It's also about our thinking about colors. If we're just thinking about the question of whether this which of these color samples is the last red one in the series, things are just as unclear in our own thought as they are in the language. We're simply not sure, as it were, in our own minds, which one to call the last. And so it's a problem of thought as well as a problem of language. It's not something to do with the inadequacy of language to thought. Language is vague, but thought is also vague. And for the reasons that I've given, whenever we try to eliminate vagueness, we have to do it by making definitions, and the words in the definitions are themselves somewhat vague because we haven't yet eliminated vagueness. And so we never completely eliminate vagueness. I mean, of course, language is more precise in some contexts than in others. For example, in legal contexts, it's often more precise than in everyday life. But even in legal contexts, even in a court of law, the words are not completely precise. And so really, we just have to live with vagueness. It's something that will always be present in our language and thought. And so we have to learn how to handle it correctly. And in particular, we have to learn whether the fact that our words are vague means that we have to modify some logical principles that we use in reasoning, which, maybe whether there are principles that are okay for, or would be okay if we had some perfectly precise words, but are not okay for vague language and vague thought. So we need to know how to reason in a vague language and how to reason in our own thought, even though our thought is vague. Now, this problem of vagueness is actually quite an ancient one. So the ancient Greeks were already familiar with problems of vagueness. In fact, it would also be interesting to know whether this was something that was discussed in ancient Chinese philosophy, but I mean, I'm not the person to tell you about that. And so with the ancient Greeks, the way that they originally raised the problem of vagueness was not by a series of purely logical arguments in the way that modern logicians might raise it, but they raised it by a series of questions. I mean, imagining a dialogue with questions and answers. And in fact, this was quite typical of Greek philosophy, where modern philosophers would articulate a paradox, by a logical argument, maybe a logical argument with premises that all seemed true and with reasoning that seemed valid, and yet with a conclusion that seemed obviously false. But the Greeks originally, they didn't do things that way. Early in their philosophy, they did things by imagining a series of questions, and how one would answer them, and the difficulties that one would get in answering them. So that in particular, the most famous example of a Sorites paradox in ancient Greece had to do with how many grains make a heap, maybe a heap of sand or a heap of grains of wheat or whatever. So they would start off with the question, do 10,000 grains make a heap? Where the answer is obviously yes. I mean, if you put them together in the right way, do 9,999 grains make a heap? Then down to 9,988, and then at some point, you start off answering yes, and then do 4 grains make a heap? Well, maybe, but do 3 grains make a heap? Do 2 grains make a heap? Does 1 grain make a heap? And it's just not clear where to give the where you should stop answering yes to these questions. And if you think you could do it with heap, if you just imagine instead of heap, something like a reasonably large heap, you'd get a very similar problem. Do 10,000 grains make a reasonably large heap? Do 4 grains make a reasonably large heap? So this is a series of questions which, if you're asked them, they put you into difficulties, and in a way which is obviously related to the problem that we were having in saying which of the color samples was the last red one. And so, for example, even if we allow people to answer the question with I don't know as opposed to yes or no, there's still going to be something unreasonable in your pattern of answers. I mean, even if you answer yes to some, and then after that you answer I don't know to some more, and then you answer no to the remaining questions, the points at which you switch from answering yes to answering I don't know, or from answering I don't know to answering no, those will seem arbitrary, and there'll seem like something unreasonable about switching from giving a definite answer to I don't know at a particular point, because one grain seems to make too little difference to justify switching from one answer to the next one. So, I mean, the sort of general feature of such cases is that many trivial differences together make an important difference. And so if you ignore each trivial difference, you end up ignoring an important difference. If you treat each trivial difference as though it were no difference, then the ultimate effect of that is that you treat an important difference as if it were no difference. And these series of cases are called, in modern philosophy as well, they're called Sorites series, because the word Sorites comes from the Greek word for a heap, soros. And so we now use the term Sorites not just for the series of cases to do with heaps, but any series of cases that raises this kind of problem, so that even the example with colors would also count as a Sorites series, the way modern philosophers use the term. And so Sorites series can be quantitative, e.g. from heap to no heap, when we subtract grains one after another, or qualitative, e.g. when we go from red to yellow by a series of indiscriminable changes. So as I've already hinted, vagueness, it also raises questions for classical logic and metalogic. So both for how we reason and how we understand our own reasoning. So one principle that is often thought to be undermined by Sorites' series is a classical law of excluded middle, which is the schema P or not P. So, for example, it says that either n-grains make a heap or n-grains do not make a heap. And it seems that Sorites' series at least raise a question about whether the law of excluded middle is actually valid when we're talking in a vague language, or when we're using sort of vague ideas in our thought. And there's a corresponding principle in metalogic, where we're not, with the law of excluded middle, that's a principle in logic in the sense that it's instances. They're not claims about the language or anything like that. They're just claims about grains and how many make a heap. But the principle of bivalence says, roughly speaking, that any statement is either true or false. So if you apply that to the Sorites series, we get that either the statement n-grains make a heap for some fixed n, either n-grains make a heap is true, or the statement n-grains make a heap is false. And obviously there's some close relation between the law of excluded middle and the principle of bivalence. In fact, you might think that doesn't really make much difference which one we're talking about. I mean, in fact, later we'll see that there is some views on which there's an important difference between the law of excluded middle and the principle of bivalence. But anyway, both these principles, you might feel, are called into question when we're using vague terms like heap, where we can't always decide. And so philosophers wonder, well, is there in fact a correct answer here in every case at all? So as I say, but both principles have been questioned for vague languages. And so just relating this to my own encounter with the problem of vagueness, both the law of excluded middle and the principle of bivalence were much discussed at Oxford in the 1970s when I was a student there, by Michael Dummett, who supervised me for a time, and many others. And they were discussed as challenges to realism, because realists, in Michael Dummett's sense, accept both excluded middle and bivalence. And in fact, I think many people at the time, they thought that that vagueness, in a way, was the strongest challenge to realism. That I think many philosophers at that time thought that vagueness was one case where where you really can't maintain realism. So they were thinking, well, you have to be some kind of anti-realist about vagueness, and then the question was, well, how much more are you going to be anti-realist about? So vagueness was in effect used as, to use English metaphor, as the thin end of the wedge. That was where the anti-realism could get a relatively easy foothold. So in a way, what people were accepting is that if anti-realism is right about anything, it's right about vagueness, because vagueness is kind of the easiest case that they were thinking, the easiest case for anti-realism. And so, of course, that also means that if you can show that or argue that anti-realism is not about vagueness, that they're not right about vagueness, then it would also follow that it's not right about anything. If it's not right about the easiest case, it's not going to be right about the more difficult cases. So as I said, just to summarize that vagueness at the time, it looked like the hardest problem for realism, the case where it was most difficult to be a realist. Because it just seemed at the time sort of ridiculous to insist that there was a right answer to these questions. So, as an undergraduate, I used to debate this problem of vagueness with my friends. Discussing, for example, whether it's solved by Michael Dunnett's preferred intuitionistic logic, which rejects excluded middle. So in general, for Michael Dunnett thought that that the proper logic for an anti-realist is something like intuitionistic logic. But that intuitionistic logic is motivated originally by issues in the philosophy of mathematics, issues about how we understand infinity and things like that. And so there's been some philosophical debate about whether you could use intuitionistic logic to solve the problem of vagueness, whether it could give you whether intuitionistic logic would give you a nice sort of anti-realist treatment of vagueness. And I think the short answer to that question is no, it doesn't. And I'm not going to discuss that in detail here, but I just very briefly, I think the reason why intuitionistic logic doesn't really help with the problem of vagueness is that intuitionistic logic, as I mentioned, was developed in order to deal with the problem of the understanding of infinity, and that's actually goes quite deep into the way that intuitionistic logic is structured. But the thing about the problem of vagueness is that it does not depend on infinity, because these Sorites series that I've been talking about, as you will have noticed, that they are finite series. I mean, you get these difficulties, if you, for example, in the case of the Sorites series, we started out with do 10,000 grains make a heap, and then we ended up with do 0 grains make a heap. So that's a sequence of 10,001 questions, and that's a finite number of questions. And it turns out that this aspect of intuitionistic logic that is really designed for giving an anti-realist treatment of infinity, because it just doesn't handle the problem of vagueness in a useful way. I mean, various people have tried to apply it, but it's just not well designed for that problem. So just to continue for a moment on my own sort of encounter with the problem of vagueness in my own philosophical work. So when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, that was on how theories in science can approximate the truth better or worse. That one scientific, even if a scientific theory is false, it can be a good or bad approximation to the truth. And so when I told other philosophers that I encountered in Oxford as a graduate student, when I was a doctoral student, when I told them that I was working on the idea of theories approximating the truth, they always ask me, is that something to do with vagueness? And I guess they were partly thinking of the approach to the problem of vagueness called fuzzy logic. And those are and there are other semantic accounts of vague languages as well, on which truth comes in degrees. So, for example, the statement there is a heat there, or it becomes slightly less true every time you subtract 1 grain. So, as it were, instead of 2 truth values, true and false, with fuzzy logic, you can have a continuum of truth values, maybe corresponding to the real numbers from 1 to 0, where 1 would correspond to perfect truth and 0 would correspond to perfect falsity. And so I think that was probably in the back of their minds when they were asking, well, is approximating the truth, is that something to do with problem of vagueness? And so I used to explain that it had nothing to do with vagueness, because a theory T, I mean, don't think of this, let's say, as a theory in physics. It may be a closer approximation to the truth than a theory T star, even if T and T star are both perfectly precise but false. And if you just think about that in terms of numbers, it's clear why that is. That if we're talking about trying to measure some physical quantity, then I mean, 2 scientists may make different measurements and propose different values for this physical quantity, and one of them may be a much better approximation to the true value than the other, but that doesn't depend on the scientists saying something vague. I mean, even if we pretend that they say something completely precise, and I mean, just to give a particular answer, I mean, supposing we're a non-scientific case would be supposing that we're talking about how many people were present in the stadium at a football match or something like that, and I mean, the answer 29 and the answer 40,233. Those are both from practical purposes precise answers, but one of them may be a much better approximation to the true number in the stadium, which is, let's say, 50,000, than the other. So this problem of better and worse approximations to the truth doesn't actually depend on the issue of vagueness. It even arises, if we somehow could have a perfectly precise language, the issue of better and worse approximations to the truth would arise for that language. So that's what I would explain to them. And privately, I was annoyed that to be asked this question, because I felt that people were insisting on linking everything to fashionable issues in Oxford at the time about logic and semantics, and not sort of appreciating how different are the kind of questions that we're interested in the philosophy of science. So I thought that their kind of follow-up question, is that something to do with vagueness, that was a product of a rather kind of stereotypical way of thinking, and in a way of an over-obsession in Oxford with problems of language. But given that that I later published the book Vagueness in 1994, it's hard to feel that they got completely the wrong idea, because maybe there was some kind of hidden connection in my mind that they were latching onto. So I feel a bit less inclined to look down on the people who were asking about connections with vagueness than I was at the time. So what I now want to do is to explain the kind of the theory of vagueness, which was quite widely accepted at the time when I was a graduate student, and it still has many supporters. It's still a very popular theory of vagueness, but I think not as popular as it was then. And like many other philosophers, I felt that this theory of vagueness, which is called supervaluationism, was really gave as good a treatment of the phenomenon of vagueness as one could expect to get. At the time that I'm talking about, in the 1970s, supervaluationism was particularly associated with Kit Fine, although the basic idea of supervaluations had actually emerged considerably earlier through work by some Polish logicians, and then later by Wassermann Frossen. But Kit Fine published this article in 1975 called Vagueness, Truth, and Logic, which was at that point the most sophisticated application of the broadly supervaluationist approach to the problem of vagueness. And in fact, Kit Fine himself no longer accepts a supervaluationist treatment. So although the theory is associated with him, if you look, he's published a recent little book on vagueness where he's putting forward a completely different theory of vagueness. In fact, one more closely related to intuitionistic logic, but which, as it were, adapts intuitionistic logic to the problem, to finite phenomena like the Sorites series. But I'm not going to be talking about that in detail here. But I want to explain how this theory of supervaluations works, because it is in many ways quite an elegant account. So supervaluationists, they work with what we can call sharpenings, which are ways of resolving and so eliminating all the vagueness in the language. So supervaluationists, they're not imagining that we could in practice achieve, or apply any of these ways of resolving all the vagueness. I mentioned the why that's not really possible, and I think supervaluationists can accept this. So these are more like as it were, just sharpenings which are out there, which kind of resolve the vague cases but keep all the clear cases, the way we are always intended them, and so we can think of them just as something like assignments of reference and truth value to the expressions of the language in a way which is kind of consistent with all that has actually so far been determined about the semantics of the language. Because the supervaluationist picture is one on which vagueness is the result of a kind of failure on the part of the linguistic community to completely specify what the semantics of the language is supposed to be. And so if we take any one sharpening and then just apply that, the semantics will be classical because all vagueness has been eliminated. So the problem of vagueness that doesn't arise for a given sharpening. And And then a key proposal on the part of supervaluationists, at least in the kind of in the traditional form of supervaluationism, which was what Fine was proposing, is that in a vague language, a statement is super true if and only if all sharpenings make it true. So, as it were, however you resolve the vagueness in the language, the super true statement will come out true. So it's, as it were, its truth value, its truth is not sensitive to which sharpening you take. And kind of symmetrically with that, a statement is super false if and only if all sharpenings make it false. So its falsity isn't sensitive to which sharpening you choose. So we've got these notions of super truth, which is truth on all sharpenings, and super falsity, which is falsity on all sharpenings. And then for what I'm calling standard supervaluationists, I'll mention another kind of non-standard form of supervaluationism later, but this is the kind of supervaluationism I'm talking about now is the main and form of it. Their proposal is, well, just ordinary truth, just for a vague language, it just is super truth, and ordinary falsity is super falsity. So that's if we make a vague statement, it's for it to be true, it's just for it to be super true, i.e. true on all sharpenings, and for it to be false is for it to be super false, i.e. false on all sharpenings. And now we can see a little bit about how this idea works out for the logic by seeing that supervaluationists, they actually accept the law of excluded middle, because any sharpening will make any instance of the statement P or not P true, and thus the statement P or not P is super true. However we resolve any vagueness in P, we're always going to end up with a situation in which P or not P is true once the vagueness has been resolved. And in fact, that this is not just about the law of excluded middle. This is it's actually about any particular theorem of classical logic, or just, for example, any theorem of standard classical first order logic. It's going to be super true because it will be true however we resolve the vagueness, whichever sharpening we choose. So for supervaluationists, there's no problem about the law of excluded middle, and in a sense, there's no problem about any particular theorem of classical logic. And as I say, more generally, supervaluationists accept all the theorems of classical logic. So if you write down any valid formula, just a single formula of first order logic, that will be super true on the supervaluationist account. But this is maybe the surprising thing. Supervaluationists actually reject the principle of bivalence. So remember, I was saying that when you first look at these two principles, it doesn't seem that it makes much difference which one you're talking about. They seem to be saying virtually the same thing. But for supervaluationists of the standard kind, there is a very, very important difference between these two principles. So that the excluded middle is okay, but bivalence is not okay. And the reason for that is one which we can see by if we just consider any borderline case. Let's say one where it's just simply unclear whether to accept the statement X is red. So X is this color sample X. It's neither clearly red nor clearly not red. And since X is not clearly red, there will be some sharpening, some resolutions of the vagueness, which make the statement X is red false. And so that tells us that the statement X is red is not super true, because there are some sharpenings on which it's false. And since the supervaluationists identify super truth with just truth, that means that it's not true. But also, since X is not clearly not red, and remember it's a borderline case, there'll be some other sharpenings, some different sharpenings, which make the statement X is red true. Because it's not clear that it isn't red. And so because of those sharpenings, the statement X is red is not super false, because it's not false on all sharpenings. And therefore, since, again, the supervaluation side, they identify super falsity with just normal falsity, that means that the statement X is red is not false. And so X is red, that statement is neither true nor false, even though the statement X is red or not red is true. So that you get that the statement X is red is a counterexample to the principle of bivalence, even though there is no problem here for the law of excluded middle. So you get this rather odd structural feature of supervaluationism. By the way, I might just mention that this, you might feel this is some kind of very weird technical thing about modern, some particular approach in modern logic and so on. But there are actually, in a completely different setting, there are actually some interpretations of Aristotle, not when he's talking about the problem of vagueness, which he doesn't really talk about, but when he talks about the problem of future contingents, like whether it's not determined whether there will be a sea battle tomorrow. And there are some things that Aristotle says about that case, which it's not very clear, but they can be interpreted as Aristotle accepting the law of excluded middle for future contingents, but not accepting the principle of bivalence. So, I mean, that's just a kind of curiosity, but it's interesting that this kind of apparently very technical feature of the supervaluationist approach might have some precedent in Aristotle. So, of course, this means that that supervaluation is, you might say, it's only a semi-classical view. It has, a lot of the features of classical logic, and including all the classical theorems, but it does not have the principle of bivalence. But you might feel that it's as close to classical logic as we can reasonably hope to get in dealing with vague language and vague thought. There's actually there's quite a lot more to say about exactly in what ways supervaluation is classical and in what ways it's not a classical theory. But those would take us into much more technical detail than I want to go into here, although of course if you want to ask about them you're welcome. But so at the time I'm talking about, which was from the time when I started working on my doctoral dissertation to the time when I started when I was more or less doing the final part of my first book, Identity and Discrimination, I couldn't really see how to make a more fully classical view of vagueness plausible. Now, in fact, there were some people who were defending at the time a more fully classical view of vagueness. It was defended from quite early on in the late 60s and 70s by the American philosopher James Cargyle, and then later it was defended by Roy Sorensen in his book Blind Spots, which was published in 1988. And And so they were not supervaluationists. They had a much more straightforward view. They insisted that a statement is either true or false in a borderline case. It's either red or it's not red. There either is a heap or there is not a heap. And that the statement that it's red is either true or false. The statement that there's a heap is either true or false, even if speakers of the language cannot in principle know which it is. And this kind of view, on which it's basically an epistemic problem, this view of vagueness is called epistemicism. For supervaluationism, problem of vagueness is basically semantic. For epistemicism, the problem of vagueness is basically epistemological. Epistemicism is the view that I later came to defend, but the trouble, I was not persuaded by Cargyle or Sorensen, because I could not find in their work any clear explanation of why we can't know the truth value in borderline cases. It wasn't that I expected that we could know the truth about everything, but I was expecting that, at least in these kind of very homely cases of vagueness, that there should be some kind of account of what is stopping us from knowing the truth. And I just couldn't find that in any satisfying form in Cargyle or Sorensen's work. So what the obstacle was to knowing the truth value. But then, and this is what I was talking about in my in the previous lecture. So in working on my first book, Identity and Discrimination, which was published in 1990, and developing my epistemic account of discrimination and indiscriminability, where I characterize those things in terms of knowledge, the possibility of knowledge, I became interested in the general phenomenon of inexact knowledge, whereby we can perceptually discriminate cases of a phenomenon P from cases of not P, when they're safely different enough from each other, but not when they're too similar. So when we can say, in some cases, we can say that, well, this is a case of the phenomenon and this other thing is not. But the cases where we can say that, they're typically cases where there's quite a difference between the two examples that we're considering. But when the examples get too close together, there's too much danger of error in saying this one is a case of P and this other one isn't. So when our powers of discrimination are limited, as they normally are, knowledge requires a margin for error. This is something I mentioned in the previous lecture. So, as it were, we in general, if we're too close to a boundary, for example, when we're, in the cases of perception, we can't actually identify which side of the line we're on, because our powers of perceptual discrimination are not strong enough. We don't have perfect eyesight and so on. And so I realized that this principle could explain our ignorance in borderline cases, because there the P cases are, like the red cases, are too close to the not P cases, the not red cases. So an adequate margin for error is lacking. But of course, it's not exactly a perceptual problem in the ordinary sense, because it's not. Our difficulty doesn't really have to do with the weakness of our eyesight. For example, in the case of the heap, the relevant type of discrimination would not be perceptual. That's not where the difficulty lies, but of a more general cognitive kind. So the idea was it's basically the same phenomenon of needing a margin for error, and so not being able to make a discrimination when cases are too close together. But but generalized from perception to cognition of other kinds as well. So I could see when I was writing Identity and Discrimination that that this might be a way of defending epistemicism, but in that book I was really undecided, and I left the issue between supervaluationism and epistemicism undecided. So I was thinking that the best theories of vagueness were supervaluationism and epistemicism, and I wasn't sure which of them was right. And in some respects, if you look at supervaluationism and epistemicism, in some ways, but not in all, they have the same kind of structure, because the sharpenings which you use in supervaluationism, they're like hypotheses for what the epistemicists would treat as hypotheses about what the extension or the reference of these vague terms is. And for the supervaluationist, these different sharpenings, it's simply semantically underdetermined which of them is correct. But for the epistemicist, it's not semantically underdetermined. It's simply that we don't know. But you still got the kind of these sharpenings playing a somewhat similar role in the two theories. So they're not quite as far apart as you might think. I mean, they do differ, because supervaluationism, as I've been describing it rejects the principle of bivalence, whereas epistemicism accepts the principle of bivalence. So they're not the same theory; they don't collapse into each other, but they have quite a lot of similarities. So by 1992, I worked out my kind of inexact knowledge in detail, and I became convinced that it really could explain the limits on our knowledge in borderline cases consistently with a fully classical logic, and including the acceptance of bivalence. And I didn't really feel that other epistemicist theories had been able to do that. They hadn't really given of an adequate explanation of the limits of our knowledge. But it seemed to me that with these reflections on inexact knowledge and margins for error, we could see the ignorance in borderline cases as just a special case of a quite general epistemic phenomenon, and so something that the epistemicist could predict on general epistemological grounds. And so, given the problems for non-classical theories of vagueness, which I haven't yet really spoken about, I felt able to defend epistemicism as the best theory of vagueness by, as I say, about 1992. And so, when I was asked by Ted Hodrick, the editor of the series, to contribute a volume to the publisher Routledge's series, The Problems of Philosophy, Their Past and Present, I proposed a volume on vagueness, and my proposal was accepted. And the result of that was my book, Vagueness, which was published in 1994. So volumes in the series, they had to be sort of half about the past of a philosophical problem and half about its present. And they were also meant to be accessible to a wide readership, not just to professional philosophers. And actually both those conditions, you might think they were rather restrictive, but actually both of them worked in my favor. So although I'm no specialist in the history of philosophy, I in fact find it quite an enjoyable experience to investigate the history of Sorites paradoxes and the problem of vagueness. And in particular, when I read about what the ancient Greek, the Stoics, in particular the great Stoic logician Chrysippus, what he said about the problem of vagueness, I could see that it could be understood as an early form of epistemicism, and actually, quite a thoughtful form of epistemicism. And the thing is, it's very, very difficult with Chrysippus because really almost none of his work has survived. It's mostly what we have are just very, very short fragments, quotations by other philosophers of his work, and often quotations or paraphrases of his work by philosophers who were quite hostile to him. Although it's certainly known that he had a tremendously high reputation as a logician in ancient times, but it seemed to me that there was enough in the evidence. Of course, I'm not a scholar of Greek philosophy, but that the fragments that there were, they could be made sense of by interpreting Chrysippus as an epistemicist. And it's known that Chrysippus was very, very keen on the principle of bivalence, which certainly suggests an epistemicist interpretation. And although other people have subsequently tried to interpret him differently, I still think that there's a good case for treating him as an epistemicist. In fact, I think the sort of historical material in the book also made it, gave the book an extra value for readers because it showed, it gave them some kind of historical entry to this philosophical problem, which was grappled with by various philosophers at different times, but mainly by philosophers at times when logic was taken very seriously, because it's really only when you take logic seriously that you realize how serious the Sorites problem is. And I was also helped by the requirement on the book that not to be too technical, because actually, although of course I like doing technical philosophy myself, I also find that much of the modern literature on vagueness, it seemed to be completely absorbed in technical problems at the cost of philosophical insight. As one gets actually in quite a lot of areas, I think, in analytic philosophy, people were giving semantic or logical solutions to what are basically epistemic problems. So they were looking in the wrong place for the solution. And so I think, as it were, it was good not to be distracted by all the technical complexity of things that people have said about the problem, and just to focus more on the basic philosophical issues. And of course, the effect of this, the book was comparatively readable, at least given for such a difficult topic. And as a result, that enabled it to have a much wider impact than it might otherwise have had. And it was also good because since the requirements of the series forced me to treat all sorts of rival theories of vagueness. I could give proper attention to the rivals to epistemicism and treat them in detail. And I think a lot of the case for epistemicism really has to do with the problems that you get into if you're not an epistemicist. So just to give you an example of the kind of problems that you get into if you're a supervaluationist, because I remember I was saying that supervaluationism, seemed to be the until only a few years before, I thought of it, well, first of all as the best, and then as at least one of the two best theories of vagueness. But there are some very specific objections to supervaluationism. So one specific objection is that it undermines the standard disquotational principle for truth. So like the principle that the statement X is red is true if and only if X is red. And that seems like a pretty basic principle about truth, which we should be quite reluctant to give up. And so, it's a worrying feature of supervaluationism that it is forced to give up that simple disquotational equivalence. And the reason they're forced to do it is if they were to accept such equivalencies, since they accept the law of excluded middle, that you could actually get quite quickly from those kind of, disquotational principle for truth and a corresponding disquotational principle for falsity, that would take you straight from excluded middle, which supervaluationists accept, to bivalence, which they reject by supervaluationist reasoning. So they have to reject the disquotational principle for truth, in principle, or for falsity, but those two principles, I think it's clear they have the same basic motivation. Whereas by contrast, epistemicists accept disquotation without problems, because epistemicists are not complicating the semantics. All the real work for epistemicists is being done in the epistemology. And so if you just have a standard semantic approach, you'll get that kind of disquotational principle. Now, if you remember, I've been talking about alternative forms of supervaluationism. I've been talking about standard supervaluationism, and then I mentioned briefly that there was such a thing as non-standard supervaluationism. And so this alternative non-standard form of supervaluationism actually accepts disquotation, and it does that because it rejects the equation of truth with supertruth, and it rejects the equation of falsity with superfalsity. So it actually takes on this non-standard kind of supervaluationism, you just have disquotational kinds of truth and falsity. And that, in fact, enables you to accept the principle of bivalence. So, you might think, well, isn't that the right form of supervaluationism to go for? I mean, this kind of non-standard supervaluationism, it still accepts all the stuff about sharpenings and so on, except that it doesn't take the final step of saying that, as it were, regular, ordinary truth is, in a vague language, is simply supertruth, and regular, ordinary falsity is simply superfalsity. So you might think, well, isn't this non-standard supervaluationism, which has been put forward by, for example, by people like Van McGee and Brian McLaughlin, isn't that the best theory of vagueness? But, well, the thing is, this alternative supervaluationism, this non-standard form, is never actually succeeded in differentiating itself from epistemicism. I mean, there have been some debates which I've been involved in, but I think it's pretty clear that they've never actually managed to say what it is about epistemicism that they really reject. I mean, they say that they're different, but they can't explain really in any precise way how they're different. And I mean, the various attempts that they've made to differentiate non-standard supervaluationism from epistemicism, pretty much, one can show that they collapse. So I don't regard supervaluationism as a rival to epistemicism. I regard it as effectively just epistemicism in a somewhat misleading, presented in a somewhat misleading way. Now, just to give you some feel for the problems of alternative non-classical approaches, I mean, why there's so much reason to accept classical framework. I'll say just a little bit about fuzzy logic, because that's the approach that I mentioned earlier as a treatment of vagueness, which postulates degrees of truth, and it actually faces quite different specific problems from those of supervaluationism. It has a quite different structure actually from supervaluationism. And it's a very, fuzzy logic is a very famous view. I mean, many people, when you say the problem of vagueness to them, they immediately think about fuzzy logic. That's and it's become quite popular in some branches of computer science and so on. But I think it's a much more problematic theory than people realize. So it does not simply postulate degrees of truth. Actually, you could even have, in a way, a kinds of degrees of truth within a supervaluationist framework. But what's central to the structure of fuzzy logic is a kind of generalization of the idea of truth functionality. And truth functionality is to do with, the idea of giving truth tables for logical operations such as negation, conjunction, disjunction, the conditional. And so, for example, in classical semantics, the truth value of the conjunction P and Q is determined by the separate truth values of the statement P and the statement Q, and that's all displayed in the standard truth table for conjunction. And in fuzzy logic, you get the same kind of idea, but generalized to degrees of truth. So that the degree of truth of the conjunction P and Q is determined by the degrees of truth of the conjuncts P and the degree of truth of Q. And that sounds like quite a neat idea, but it's actually this generalization of truth functionality is deeply problematic. So let me explain why it's problematic. And I think the easiest way to do that, without going into too much detail, is by making an analogy between degrees of truth and probabilities. It's just an analogy, it's not an identity. So we can compare degrees of truth to probabilities, because they're both based on a scale of real numbers from 1 to 0. So in fuzzy logic, if the statement P is perfectly true, then it has degree of truth 1, and that corresponds to certainty within the probabilistic framework, and or if you like, being certainly true. It appears the statement P is perfectly false. It has degree of truth 0, which corresponds to being certainly false in the probabilistic framework. And if P is the statement is perfectly borderline, it has degree of truth 1/2, which in the probabilistic framework corresponds to P and not P being equally likely, and then the sort of intermediate values between 0 and 1/2 and between 1/2 and 1, that they are interpreted in analogous ways. So far that all sounds fine. But if you think about the generalization of truth functionality to degrees of truth, it corresponds to the idea that the probability of the conjunction P and Q is determined by the probability of the conjunct P and the probability of the conjunct Q. Now, that idea is actually completely wrong if you just think about some elementary examples. for example, if P has probability a half and Q also has probability a half, then the probability of P and Q is actually not determined by that. It could be, anything from a half to 0. So, for example, let's suppose that P is, we're tossing a fair coin, and the only options are it comes up heads or it comes up tails. So if P is the statement that the coin comes up heads, so that has probability a half. Now, Q could be the statement that the coin does not come up tails, which will also have probability a half, but they're equivalent, and so the probability of P and Q on that interpretation of Q would be a half. But if we take Q to be the statement that the coin comes up tails, then P and Q are being interpreted as inconsistent statements, mutually inconsistent statements. So the probability of them both being true is 0. So what that shows is that the probability of a conjunction is simply not determined by the probability of the conjuncts. And so that, as it were, if you take the analog of generalized truth functionality for probability, you see that it's wrong. And in fact, in completely similar examples with borderline statements show that fuzzy logic's assignments of degrees of truth to conjunctions are ill-motivated. So the ones you need to look at in the case of vagueness are ones where you have a statement which has probability a half. So, let's say the statement, it's red, when you're completely 50-50 as to whether it's red or not. And then you can interpret Q as either also meaning it's red, just maybe verbally different, or as meaning it's not red. And you get exactly the same problem, that in effect the conjunction it's red and it's red has the same, will have to have the same degree of truth as the conjunction is red and it's not red, and that's not the result that you want. So that's why there's actually the structure of fuzzy logic gives these very, very bad results, they're the result of quite a central feature of fuzzy logic, this generalized truth functionality. So that's one kind of problem. There's another general phenomenon that's very important with vagueness, which tends to raise difficulties for all non-classical approaches. And that's a phenomenon that's known as higher order vagueness. So higher order vagueness is vagueness in our descriptions of vagueness. So for instance, just as the term red is vague as applied to the Sorites series, because the question which sample is the last red one, is problematic because of vagueness. But then so is the sort of higher order category of being borderline red. We might ask, well, which is the last borderline red color sample? And that question will be just as hard to answer as the question, which is the last red one, because just as we don't know where to put the line between red and not red, we don't know where to put the line, for example, between clearly red and borderline red. We get same sort of problems coming up again. And this kind of higher order vagueness makes trouble for non-classical theories of vagueness. So just to give the two sort of salient examples, for supervaluationism, the trouble that you get from higher order vagueness is this, that identifying true with super true rather than with disquotationally true would make sense if super true were a precise category, whereas disquotationally true, as were vague. Disquotationally true is just a standard notion of truth which obeys the disquotational principle. So if identifying truth with supertruth gave us a precise notion of truth, that would be some compensation for losing disquotation. But once we realize that supertrue is also going to be vague because of higher order vagueness, there is no such compensation where even identifying truth with supertruth doesn't give us a precise way of understanding truth. And so there's no compensation for the loss of disquotation. And so it would make much more sense to identify true with disquotationally true rather than with supertrue, because that way we will preserve disquotation and we're not giving up on any possibility of precision. But once you identify truth with disquotational truth in the supervaluationist framework, it actually collapses into epistemicism in the way that I mentioned before. So that's one way in which higher order vagueness is problematic for supervaluationism. And so for fuzzy logic, I think it's fairly clear why it's problematic, because the apparent precision of numerical degrees of truth is undermined once we appreciate the massive vagueness of statements such as the degree of truth of, quote, X is, well, the statement X is read is, let's say, 0.7329. I mean, it might seem that because we're using numbers, that we're getting more precise about vagueness in fuzzy logic. But in fact, because the principles of the assignments of degrees of truth are so totally unclear and vague, we're actually just getting, things are not getting more precise by bringing in these numerical degrees of truth. They're actually contributing further vagueness, but higher order vagueness. So, if we contrast this with the case of epistemicism, so epistemicism has no trouble with higher order vagueness, because for an epistemicist, which interprets that as it were vagueness in terms of ignorance, higher order vagueness is just ignorance about our own ignorance. And such higher order ignorance is predicted by the theory of margins for error, so that it's just quite a normal thing that we're not simply ignorant about the world. I mean, we're also ignorant about our ignorance of the world. Because we're ignorant about the limits of our knowledge. For example, we may think that we have more knowledge than we really do. So by normal scientific standards of theory choice, in the book, epistemicism is the best theory of vagueness. It's consistent with all the evidence. I mean, there are no phenomena of vagueness which can just refute it, which are just counter examples to it, and it predicts the structural features of the phenomena of vagueness, such as borderline cases and higher order vagueness, and it predicts them on the basis of independently supported epistemological principles. For example, the idea of margins for error, and epistemicism is based on classical logic, which combines simplicity and strength better than any other logic. It's one of the most simple logics, and it's also one of the most powerful logics. And also classical logic has been far more severely tested than any other logic in science through its role as a background logic of standard mathematics, which of course is being applied all the time in science, and classical logic is being applied all the time in mathematical proofs. And so I think, this is an often underestimated advantage of classical logic, that it's really been tested to the point where if there were anything wrong with it, it would have led to destruction. Whereas all the non-classical logics that get advocated, they've barely been tested at all in the kind of serious way that I'm talking about, and so it seems much better to stick with a logic which has really been subject to very severe testing and has basically triumphed in those tests. So, of course, many people still object to epistemicism, though I think most of the objections basically come down to an incredulous stare. That phrase was originally used by David Lewis to describe what people don't like about his modal realism about possible worlds. So it's just people find that they can't believe such a theory. But I think of course the incredulous stares. They often just reflect philosophical prejudices, and I would say, in particular, in the case of David Lewis's modal realism, I think the best objections to it are not incredulous stares, but rather some specific features of it, which I'm going to go into now. And in my recent book, Suppose and Tell, which came out last year, which is it's mainly about conditionals, but one minor theme in it is to explain how such an incredulous stare may arise from the heuristics on which we rely on sort of quick and easy ways of answering questions whose imperfect reliability is not transparent to us. So these are heuristics, are things that psychologists are often aware of. And in Suppose and Tell, I keep, although it's, as I say, it's mainly about conditionals, I also have a little bit of discussion of the problem of vagueness. And I use this idea of the heuristics on which we rely to explain why people might find the epistemicism such an implausible view, and the idea is, well, because it violates certain kind of heuristics that we use. I mean, for example, about if we call one item in a Sorites series red, then we want to call the next one red, and so on. And so, because it violates those heuristics that we normally rely on unreflectively, it seems implausible. But nevertheless, those heuristics, they're not reliable, and I mean they have quite a high degree of reliability, but not 100%, maybe as it were 95% or something. And so I hope to extend such explanations in the future, to do maybe some more work on it, just how it is that psychologically we're led to ways of thinking about vagueness, which make an epistemicist theory hard for many people to accept. But anyway, that's work for the future. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the comments. So I will now sharing.
Okay, first let's thank the speaker for this very wonderful and insightful lecture. Okay, it's very impressive for me that Williamson is not only satisfied with giving a solution to a very popular and difficult philosophical question, but also he seek for one possible best solution for this question. Okay, now the following procedure is as follows. First, is our pleasure to introduce the interlocutor of this lecture, and Professor Wenfang from Shandong University. And firstly, it's my pleasure to give a brief introduction of Professor Wang. Professor Wang Wenfang is currently a professor of School of Philosophy and Social Development at Shandong University. He is also a member of the editing board of Studies in Logic, a member of the Standing Committee of International Law, and a member of the Standing Committee of Chinese Logical Society. His specialization areas include philosophy of logic, metaphysics, philosophy of language, formal epistemology, and AI philosophy. He is the author of 4 books and has published more than 60 articles in Journal of Philosophical Logic, Synthesis, the Philosophical Form, Journal of Philosophical Research, and so on. Okay, now it's time for Professor Wang, and he first give his comment and propose his questions to the speaker, and then Professor Williamson will reply to his comment or questions. Okay, please.
Thank Professor Yong for his introduction. I actually had no comments about Tim's talk, but I have several questions. The talk is very wonderful. Yeah, it makes it aim at a very technical questions, but speak in a very non-technical way. So I believe that is very friendly to many audience today. But still, I have several questions for Professor Williamson. So, but I'm wondering, if you like me to give all the questions at a time, or you want me to ask questions one by one.
I think it's maybe easier for people to follow if I answer each question as you ask it, because then they'll remember what I'm responding to. So shall we do it that way?
Okay. So I will also put my questions in chatting room so that everybody can read it if they couldn't understand my English. All right. So that's the first question. So you are right. Most objection to your view, that is epistemicism, come down to the incredulous stare. So I'm one of the person who will give you an incredulous stare. So the main problem, the main objection to the main reason for giving such an incredulous stare is simply this. If any vector has a sharp boundary, as you insist, and if also our usage of a term determine its meaning and therefore determine its extension, as you also endorse, then there must be some fact in our use of a vector that determines its boundary. But so far, no plausible account, either by you or by Sorensen or by Fragile, has ever been offered about what that fact is. So what?
Yes. Well, thank you. And I think this is actually a concern that is quite widely shared. And so my view is this, that I mean, I accept the general things that you say about how reference is determined and so on. But I think that it's actually just a much more general problem that we don't have a good theory of reference determination. So that even if you put vagueness aside and then you ask so what in our use of a some predicate determines, let's say the predicate spy or something like that, determines its reference, then it's incredibly hard actually to say what the answer to that problem is. So for example, it's not that somebody is a spy if and only if most people say that they're a spy, because somebody can be, if they're a very good spy, then most people will think they're not a spy, and so on. And so it's not simply to do with how people apply the term. It's something much more complicated than that, which we actually don't really have a systematic theory of. So what I would say is I agree that we don't have a good theory of how this works for vague terms, but I would also say that we don't have a good theory of how it works, even putting aside the problem of vagueness. And so I think it would, maybe one day we will have a good theory of this in general, and then that will be the time to see how it applies to vague terms. But I think it's too kind of premature to blame it on any particular theory of vagueness when we're just in general quite ignorant about this matter.
Okay. Well, if you insist that, then I will have no further question about this issue. But I will ask another question about, say, what do you think about the benefit of your theory? Yeah. So, all right. Here's another one. So you claim that your view is the only view that is consistent with a fully classical logic. But say my concern is that why is it a merit of your view? Why should any theory be consistent with a fully classical logic? Of course, you said that. Classical logic has been much more severely tested than any other logic in science through its role as the background logic of standard mathematics. But I see no reason why the severe test favor the classical logic rather than non-classical logics. The main reason is this, that many nowadays non-classical logic just take classical logic simply to be a special case of the non-classical logic. That is, they take classical logic, to be their logic when restricted to precise the language. So classical logic is just a special case of their logical application. Now, if, say, classical logic survive through the severe test that you mentioned in mathematics, right? That doesn't come, as a favor for classical logic because it's only a part of a special case of, say, many non-classical logic. So many non-classical logicians will say that, well, you also test that, say, my theory is correct.
Yes.
So what will you respond to that?
Yeah. So of course, I agree that is the line that many non-classical logicians will take. So I think I would make 2 points about that. I mean, one is that if we just apply general criteria that are used for theory comparison in other sciences, and which I've are very briefly summarized by talking about simplicity and strength. I think the classical logic does better than virtually all these other theories because it's an extremely simple theory, and it's also an extremely it's very strong inferentially. So that as it were, I think by normal standards of theory comparison, it does better. I mean, of course, there's a question of how these theories fit with evidence, but I take it that there's no evidence which is actually inconsistent with classical logic. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect is that I think in many cases, although non-classical logicians claim that their approach is kind of non-revisionary of mathematics because because it will have classical logic as a special case. That when you look at applied mathematics, where we're actually, applying mathematics to physical phenomena, then the reasons that they're giving for being non-classical will actually extend to applied mathematics. So in the case of vagueness, for example, the people who reject the law of excluded middle for vague expressions, I mean, what they think is that there's no vagueness in mathematics. And so they don't have to reject excluded middle for mathematics. But once you start actually instantiating theorems of mathematics with expressions that are relevant to the physical world, then you're introducing vagueness, and so the proofs that are supposed to lead to these results are actually invalid by their own account. So I think that they actually are underestimating the implications of their own critique of classical logic. That they can't. They're not actually in a position where they can insist on classical logic within mathematics. Once you start considering applications of mathematics to the natural sciences.
All right. Well, let me suppose that you are right about, say, the logical application. Maybe the logical applications testify that the classical logic is better than other logic. But you just said that, and there is, so far, there is no evidence against the classical logic. But many people think that one of the obvious evidence against classical logic is just the liar's paradox. You can't have classical logic and post the classical logic and what you call the disquotation principle for truth. So you have to abandon one of them.
Yes. So I agree, and actually in some of there's a paper called where I've talked about the application of abductive methodology to semantic paradoxes. I mean, where I argue that we should be giving a much higher priority to classical logic than to disquotational principles, because classical logic is needed, all the way through science, whereas disquotational principles are relatively specific, and so the explanatory loss in giving up classical logic is much greater than the loss in giving up disquotational principles. I mean, so it's not that the liar paradoxes they don't directly refute classical logic. It's just that they show arguably they show that you have to give up one or other of classical logic and disquotational principles, and then I think the right move is to give up or restrict the disquotational principles.
All right. If you don't mind, I would like to go a step further about this question. The paper you just mentioned, I believe, is published in 2019 anthology, which is a collected papers for liar's paradox.
Yes.
You wrote one of the papers, yeah. And
yes.
In that paper, you argued that, from the methodological point of view, we should favor classical logic than other non-classical logic. But also, Grand Priest also proposed that, abduction should be the right method for philosophy. So both of you endorse the methodology, but it's taking abduction as the methodology. But he would conclude that non-classical logic is the right logic, and you will conclude that classical logic is the right logic. But my point is that I don't see methodology, especially abduction, is good enough for theory picking for philosophers.
Yeah, but I mean, those problems arise within natural science itself. I mean, because in many scientific disputes, the scientists, I mean, they don't disagree about the general methodology of science, but they just disagree about how it should be applied in particular cases, and some of them may be applying it better than others. So that I don't think that it just, as it were, it discredits the methodology, or shows that the methodology is inadequate if people who agree on it sometimes have specific disagreements, because that's completely normal in science. And of course, then we have to look more carefully at who's applying the methodology in a better way. And and of course, I mean, then we would have to get into a much more specific argument about the things that Graham Priest is saying and the things that I'm saying. So that I don't think it means that we need some different methodology. It just means that that applying the abductive methodology is not a kind of purely mechanical matter. It's something that requires a lot of judgment and
dispute.
We're disagreeing about what the effect of applying it is, but I don't regard that disagreement as any as so different from just two scientists who disagree about what abductive methodology favors in some kind of normal scientific.
All right. You also just agreed that, say, from a methodological point of view, so the liar paradox shows that you can both have classical logic and disquotation principle for truth. So your proposal is that, say, we should just keep the classical logic and maybe restrict the disquotation principle for
Yes.
in a certain way. But you also, in today's talk, you also criticize supervaluationists. You say that they have to abandon the disquotation principle. I think that's a little bit too strong. The supervaluationists can just you would just restrict the application of the disquotation principle to non-vague sentences. So both you and the supervaluationist has to restrict the disquotation principle in a certain way. Why it is a defect, disadvantages for supervaluationists to do so. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the difference is, of course, what you say is right about the general situation, but for the in the case of the semantic paradoxes, the restrictions are only apply to, as it were, a very, very restricted class of pathological sentences, which are really only arise in very in kind of odd situations, and whereas in the case of vagueness, arguably, all sentences of our language are vague, and vague in the language and vague in our thought, and so it's so that, as it were, the disquotational principle would be failing not for some very small class of pathological sentences, but basically for every sentence in a normal language.
Right. You're right. So the problem is about the scope. So your restriction has a minor scope than theirs.
Yes.
All right. So another question. So when I heard you say that, you can explain the higher order vagueness in terms of ignorance, right? You say that the higher order vagueness is just the ignorance of our ignorance.
Yes.
That at first sounds reasonable and wonderful and beautiful, explanation about the higher order vagueness. However, some people will say that, when you think about it through, it's not really, say any explanation at all. For example, if somebody take your theory, right, and he think that say, well, now I know that we are ignorant, right, about the boundary, but we are not ignorant about our ignorance, right, because he accepts your theory. So he's not ignorant about his ignorance, but he still feels that say there are higher order vagueness phenomena for all vague terms.
I mean, it's not that we're, it's not that we're totally ignorant about our ignorance, but so for example, if my theory is correct, and then somebody, maybe somebody knows that it's correct, then that gives them some kind of sort of general knowledge, about the nature of the ignorance and so on. But but they will still have lots. It won't prevent them from being ignorant about their ignorance in all sorts of specific cases. I mean, for example, if somebody plays a trick on us, they put a wax orange in a fruit bowl, and we pick it up thinking that it's a real orange, then we think we know that it's a real orange, but of course we don't know that it's a real orange because it isn't a real orange, and so in that case we're ignorant of what this thing we're picking up is, but we're also ignorant of our ignorance because we don't realize that we're ignorant, and however much kind of epistemology somebody studies, that won't prevent them from being tricked in specific ways, and so I think the ignorance of ignorance is not so much ignorance about general epistemology, but just ignorance about what particular epistemic situation we're in, on a particular occasion.
Okay. Now, my final question. So I will leave some time for other audience to raise their question. My final question, not actually a question. I would like to say defend fuzzy theory a little bit against your objection, your criticism. One of your criticism about the fuzzy theory is that they take those sentences connected to be truth functional, and you think that is a wrong idea. You use the probability theory. You use probability as an example to show why that idea is wrong. But fuzzy theorists might object to you that say truth is certainly not the same thing as probability. For example, say probability can be explained in statistics as a portion of a population, but truth can never be explained in that way. So it seems to me that your criticism is quite out of place. What will you respond to this defense of fuzzy theory?
Yeah. So this analogy, I completely agree that fuzzy logicians that they will not identify degree of truth with probability. It was really just a structural analogy to show what the structural problem is. But of course, I completely agree that you have to look in detail at cases to see what the effect is, and so I think and I very, very briefly did that in the lecture, but it wasn't probably written down in the slide. But so for example, if we're giving a degree of truth a half to the statement this is red, then we will also give degree of truth a half to this is not red. That's just by the rules of fuzzy logic, and then the rules of fuzzy logic will also say we have to give the same degree of truth a half to the statement this is red and this is red, which of course is just equivalent to saying this is red, and the contradiction this is red and this is not red. And but that seems to be, the wrong assignment of degree of truth, because with the case of this is red, it's a statement that we're kind of, we feel 50-50 on, and so assigning a good degree of truth of a half is quite natural. Whereas with the statement this is red and not red, that's a contradiction, and we don't feel 50-50 about that. There's no way we want to contradict ourselves about this borderline case. And so, but the rules of fuzzy logic are they're kind of forcing us to treat these two conjunctions the same and to give it a probability of half. And so the analogy with probability is just, you can actually cash it out by looking at the particular examples, and you see that the fuzzy logic predictions are very implausible. I mean, so another one would be if we have two samples of two color samples which are exactly the same shade, then one thing we definitely don't want to say is shade A is red and shade B is not red when they're exactly the same shade, and yet fuzzy logic will force us to say that. So that's, as it were, the analogy with probability is just a kind of introduction to what's going on in examples like that, which I think the examples themselves don't depend on identifying degrees of truth with probabilities.
Okay. I think I have occupied too much time. I also see some questions from our audience. Maybe I should leave some time for our audience.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your
many thanks for your replies.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang's questions and Professor Williamson's replies. Okay, I see some questions from our audience. The first question asks that as following. He says that in your theorem, you posit a margin for error. Presumably, that margin is also vague. Exactly how would your theorem deal with the higher order vagueness problems?
So yes, so it's of course the statements about margins for error are also vague. That's absolutely right, and so that vagueness is also something that we are ignorant of to some extent, and so if we in order to model it exactly, what we need are a formal. If we're going to do a sort of formal models, we need formal models where roughly, to put it in terms of possible worlds, where at different worlds you have different margins for error, and I've taken into account the possibility of worlds like that in some of my work in epistemology, for example, in the paper Inexact Knowledge, and also in a more recent paper. I mean, these are not specifically about vagueness, but they do have to do with margins for error. I have a recent paper called we published last year, I think, but called I think it's called the KK principle and rotational symmetry, and there I'm allowing for models where you have variation in the size of the margin for error. I mean, the technical problem is just things get extremely complicated once you allow for that, and so it's kind of difficult give nice simple models in which it's allowed for. But I mean, there's no in principle there's no technical obstacle to doing that. It's just that you have to deal with very complicated models to capture it.
This has been developed in your book for the problem of the higher order vagueness problem in your book.
Well, the problem of higher order vagueness is just that's discussed in the vagueness book, but I don't actually just trying to. I don't think that I explain in detail how to give models for that because the book is meant to be relatively non-technical. So the the models in which you get that kind of variation, that's something that I've talked about in later papers. But I think it's it was always as far as I was concerned, just holding the margin fixed was always just an idealization, in order to get models which have a relatively simple structure, so that that are easier to use for heuristic purposes.
Okay, all audience are very welcome to post your question in the chat box, and the staff will forward the question to us. Another question from the audience asked, when does the safety condition of a knowledge hold, and when not? Sorry if I missed a part of the lecture, and I'm asking you to repeat yourself.
Okay, so the idea is that the safety, in principle, some kind of safety condition always holds, but the size of the margin for error varies, and so, for example, when we're in certain simple situations, we can. We can know, for example, if we're in a room with just a small number of people in it, we can easily know just exactly how many people are in the room. But if we're in a football stadium and we want to, we can't know exactly how many people are in a football stadium because we're not able to count and we can't see them all and so on. And so there in that situation we need a much wider margin for error, in the sense that we might be able to estimate within 10,000 or something like that, but we can't estimate the exact. We can't know what the exact number is. We might just know that it's between 40,000 and 60,000 or something like that. And so the exact size of the margin for error, that just depends on the circumstances, and in the sense that if we're measuring it by things like what kind of range of values do we need to give, that that may depend on how good our eyesight is, and so on. But these are just that's just a matter of what the particular circumstances are, but the general principle that you roughly speaking you only know if you're safe from error. That's meant to be a universal principle, and all that varies is how it's realized in different circumstances.
Okay, audience, you can continue to input your question if you have. Okay, I also have some questions, and I'm clever to communicate with you under these cases. Is my understanding for your analysis of the border paradox is correct. You say that it's knowable that there is some n such that having n hills is bored, but having n plus 1 hills is not bored. But we don't have that. There is some n's such that it's knowable that having n hill is bored, but having n plus 1 hill is not bored. Is my understanding correct for your viewpoint about your epistemicism? Yeah.
Yes. So you're saying we can the idea is we can know that there is a cutoff, but we can't know where the cutoff is. We don't know which number is the cutoff, but we know that some number is the cutoff between bold and not bold. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So we know there is some cutoff, but we don't have that. There is some specific cutoff so that we know it.
Yes.
Am I understanding correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah, it's in logic there are many this kind of results. Okay. In your slide, you claim that according to the normal scientific standards of theory choice, your epistemicism is the best theorem for the problem of vagueness. So, can you explain what's the standard of the theory choice you use to claim that your viewpoint is the best theorem?
Yeah. So the standards of theory choice that I was talking about are things like simplicity, elegance, those kind of, but also strength in the sense of being a highly informative theory, and its ability to explain the evidence, and in particular, I think a lot of this has to do with the way in which classical logic itself is, it does better than non-classical logics on things of criteria. So I think it's, as it were, it's the sorts of standards that are relevant are the ones involved in abductive methodology, or as people sometimes say, inference to the best explanation. And I think that I think by those standards, epistemicism is the one that does best.
Okay. Yeah, my concern is that there are many evidence that your theory is a good theory, but my question is that how can you see that it's the best theory? Yeah, this is my concern. Okay.
So I thought, of course, with any scientific theory, you might feel, how can we be sure that this is the best theory of the phenomenon? Maybe some better one will come along. But I think primarily what I wanted to emphasize is that it's the best available theory. But that. And so, of course, I'm not claiming. When I'm saying that, I'm not. I don't mean that. That there couldn't be some improvement on what I say in the book. I'm absolutely sure that there can be. In some ways, I've tried to improve it myself. But I think that one could be fairly confident that something along these lines, no doubt, with some extra improvements, is is correct. I mean, my view, I don't think there's any. I don't regard classical logic as much threatened by any non-classical logics, and there's really no. I mean, although of course many people have advocated all sorts of forms of non-classical logic, but there isn't much sign of classical logic being replaced, as the dominant theory of logic by any alternative. I mean, that's not likely, so I'm only saying this in the way that one might make a corresponding claim about some scientific theory that where of course we want to allow for the fact that our understanding of these matters is surely going to improve, but that doesn't mean that we can't say that some theory is at least the best available, and we can be fairly confident that it's close to the truth.
Okay, thank you. Maybe my last question, Professor Wang also mentioned this. You claim that the epistemicist view is the only view that it is consistent with of classical logic. Yeah, my question is, maybe you know that Professor Hannes Latgib, he proposed a theory about Ramsey semantic. He claims that the classical logic assumes that there is the unit to one intended interpretation, but this assumption cannot deal with the problem of semantic indeterminacy. So he proposed his Ramsey semantic to deal with the problem of semantic indeterminacy. He claims that unlike epistemicism, if we ask to stay much closer to classical semantics than supervaluationism, we could just Ramsey-find the classical semantics. Also, we can give a much better analysis of the problem of vagueness. So, how do you think of this?
Okay.
Yeah, so, I think that obviously we would need to get more into that sort of technical details, but many of the key epistemicist claims actually simply be derived from a fairly straightforward description of our epistemic situation, plus just classical logic and bivalence, and so that, for example, it's simply pretty much an agreed fact about our epistemic situation that we don't know, let's say, whether this is red, and then if we enter that for example, that either this shade is red or it isn't, and so either it's true that this is a shade of red, or it's true that it isn't a shade of red, and so there is some truth that we don't know here, and so you can as it were reach a lot of characteristic epistemicist claims by simply using those very straightforward kinds of principles, plus a pretty much an agreed description of examples, and And so I think the situation is going to be when we're faced with some claim of semantic indeterminacy, that either the claim of semantic indeterminacy is actually kind of accepts everything that this sort of, as it were, minimal version of epistemicism has said. And if it does that, I think it's going to be in something like the situation of the kind of non-standard form of supervaluationism that I was describing, where it actually simply fails to differentiate itself from epistemicism because it's actually accepting all the epistemicist key claims, and then as a result of that, the supposed semantic indeterminacy actually just comes out as a form of of ignorance, or else it actually is incompatible with this kind of, as it were, minimal version of epistemicism. And then if it's incompatible with it, it will be either rejecting some classical logic, or it will be rejecting maybe principles of as it were, some kind of close approximation to the utterly unrestricted disquotational principle for truth, or modulo the semantic paradoxes, or else it will be rejecting a fairly widely agreed, as what I would say, commonsensical description of our epistemic situation in these examples. So I think it's, a view like Gens is going to be on one of the horns of that dilemma fundamentally.
Okay, thank you. Maybe other colleagues has questions.
There is a question online.
Yeah. From Wang Haiyu. Wang Haiyu说final question. Yes, Wang Haiyu.
Well, I'm willing to go on, as long as you like. But So which
the final one. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't open. Yeah.
Yes, I put it on my chat. So this is.
Yeah. 王海若说呀。
王海若 please open your you test your audio.
Michael.
I'm sorry. My question is on the chat bot. Hawthorne and Kay claim that the semantic indiscriminability view is the core thesis in U.S. epistemicism. But they think that it is problematic. And the main idea is that there are two ways to attribute truth values to sentences, like A is a borderline F, or A is a borderline case of F under the view. Because do you have any comment on the argument?
Yeah. So I think that there's a complex area here where what we're trying to do, is in applying the things like Martin principles and so on, is we're trying to separate out two dimensions. One of which is the kind of the dimension of the, as it were, the variation in the underlying facts. I mean, for example, facts about the number of grains or whatever, and one of which is variation in the meaning of our expressions. And I think there's a literature to develop which is really has to do with the fact that that these dimensions are not in fact totally independent of each other. So that because once we start talking about higher order vagueness, then the facts about meanings are also part of the facts about the world, and so we can't get these completely this complete independence, and I think one effect of this is that when we're dealing with complex statements, and particularly metalinguistic statements, the kind of simple description of what I was, that I gave of, the margin for error problems, for ordinary borderline cases, it isn't, doesn't really capture the complexity of what's going on. So I think that as well, fundamentally the same kind of principles apply, but they apply in more complex ways when we're discussing more complex statements, where there isn't a nice separation between the facts about meaning and the facts about the world, which I was relying on in dealing with the simple cases. I mean, if you're interested in taking this a bit further, there's an issue of the Canadian, a sort of supplement to the Canadian Journal of Philosophy for 2016, where which is mostly about people discussing my views on modal logic, but there's also an interesting paper in it by Yohani Ilivakuri, and then I have a response to that paper, where he's talking about the semantics of vagueness, and he's dealing with examples which are kind of related to the Hawthorne and Kai examples, and also to examples used by Ofra Magador, and I'm kind of explaining how the approach needs to be and can be extended to these cases. So you can see that it's still applying the same basic ideas, but because we're dealing with a more complex statement, where, like A is borderline F, which is a metalinguistic statement, that the details of the account have to be more elaborate to explain what's going on in that kind of account. So so I think it's true that what I was what I did was to give a kind of explanation of what the mechanism is for simple cases, and then and I accept that there are more complicated cases, and including ones with metalinguistic statements, where the details of the explanation will need to be different to take account of the complexity of the case. But I think the underlying spirit of the approach is all still within the epistemicist theory. But as I say, I give some details in that reply to Eva Kuri in 2016. So that's the most recent thing that I've written that is closest to the Hawthorne and Kai issues.
Thanks for your answer. I have the last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
That is the concept indiscriminability. And I think there are two ways to understand the indiscriminability relation between objects relative to a vague predicate. Suppose A and B are indiscriminable with respect to F, then I can understand it as that if the two objects were put together, speakers could not be sure whether one is more likely to be F than the other is. But I can also understand it as that speakers would always make similar judgments about whether F applies to the object or not, whenever they encountered with A or encountered with B. And do you think the two ways of understanding the indiscriminability relation are identical?
Yeah. So I would be very. I don't think they're equivalent because speakers making similar judgments. That has to do with what, as we're more with what speakers believe than with what speakers know, and so, for example, suppose that you have a speaker who makes a lot of random judgments. Then the speaker might just randomly say different things about A and B, and yet they couldn't. But that wouldn't mean that they were able to discriminate between A and B, because they don't really know any difference between them. But they just, because they're talking at random, they'll say things, and even if it was non-random, so for example, if they were influenced by irrelevant factors, so they were supposed to be making judgments about the color of A and B, but suppose that A and B also had different shapes, and somehow this speaker was much more willing to call triangles red than to call squares red or something like that, so that they're just stupidly influenced by this irrelevant factor. Then they might make they might be, let's say, consistently say that this triangle is red and this square is not red, even though they're actually the same, exactly the same shade of color, and so that would be another kind of not just random but actually quite consistent difference in their color judgments about the square and the triangle. But it wouldn't mean that they were actually able to discriminate between the square and the color in color, because there is no difference for them to discriminate. So I think those criteria will actually lead in some different results.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
Okay, we have run out of the time. Okay, thank the speaker, Professor Williamson, for the very wonderful lecture. Also, thank Professor Wang, and thank for our audience for attending this lecture. Okay, it's time to say goodbye. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, and thank you for all the excellent questions that I've been asked.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're looking forward to your next lecture. Okay, the next Saturday. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, bye-bye. Okay.
Goodbye.